while we're here. I'd like to call the finance meeting to order. We'll start with the roll call, starting with Dan.
Great. Dan Schultz, present.
Joel Fishbein here.
Zachary Epps, present.
David Cohen present.
Jennifer Lemon, present. Julie Hayward, present. Leah Mullen here. Pamela Henry, present. So I have a motion to approve last month's minutes. Second. I think Julie makes motion, Jenny seconded. Is that all in favor? Say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, say nay. The ayes carry. And I will turn it over to Mr. Sweatguard.
All right, I'm gonna try and do this standing up. Or not.
You might have to clear, you might have to take the annotation tool. It's still not working, huh? Zoom is not cooperating.
I can do it sitting down.
Okay.
Do you want to say that? Do you want me to do it?
No, I'm good. I'll just, thank you. All right, so for the finance committee meeting tonight, we're going to follow the same format. We're going to take a look at our interim financial performance through the end of April 30th for 2023 versus 2022. We're going to revisit the end of year projection, how we expect the year to close out for the 2023 school fiscal year through June 30th, 2023. Tonight, we have to take a look at the projected final budget or the proposed final budget. That has to be approved by the board at the next week's legislative meeting because we have to advertise that budget for its approval on June 13th. And then finally, we'll talk a little more in depth on capital planning and the stadium at the high school. All right, so as always, I present the balance sheet, and again, we focus on cash. We are showing a $9 million increase in cash from year to year. Part of that is due to timing, but such a large increase is a good indication that we will have another surplus. Year over year, revenues over expenditures, we're doing better to the tune of 4.2 million. Again, this is on a pure cash basis, so just money coming in, coming out, no sort of accruals or official accounts payable, just interfund payables and payroll. Looking at our actual year-to-year revenues, you can see we're still running very well, $6 million over the prior year. This is consistent with prior months. I won't spend a lot of time on this because we're hitting the same topics over and over again. There's some ESSER spending that led to this $2.3 million increase in spending. We also have salary increases, and we also have additional special ed teaching positions, which is a large reason you see a $1.2 million increase in special ed costs. The data is presented again here by object, which allows you to take a better look at what is salary, what is benefits versus everything else. And you can see salary and benefits make up the majority of our expenditures on an annual basis. Last month, we talked about the difference in expenditure being because of the payroll cycle. This year, we're back on that same number of payrolls as the prior year. So you can see our expenditure line trajectory takes a much different turn. And if we project it out, you can see we're probably not going to hit our budgeted 127 million for the end of the year. We're going to get close. And depending on how the rest of this year shapes out, we should see a higher than budgeted 127 million. As shown by this end of year projection. Sorry, that was a little tough. So we had $127 million budget on the revenue side. Based on current collections that have already happened, we're anticipating a $3 million increase in local source revenue this year versus prior year. Part of that is increase in the real estate taxes, increases in interest income, and still strong increases in our local tax collection. Not quite record-breaking in terms of real estate transfer tax like last year based on the volume of refinances and home sales, but still doing better than anticipated, and almost decade record year in interest income. On the expenditure side, I think this budget was a little inflated. The $7 million projection is a much more realistic number. And on the athletic side that we talked about last month, this student activity number was missing coach pay. So 1.5 million for co-curricular is right around typical on a yearly basis, probably a tad higher than in the past. And all this leads us to 130 million, almost $131 million in projected revenues versus $126 million in projected expenditures, approximately, leaving us with a projected surplus to the end of the year of almost $5 million for 2023. So another strong financial finish. Any questions on the projected financials to the end of the year? Sorry, I kind of buzzed through them because I feel like I'm repeating myself each one. We're still clear. All right, now taking a look at the proposed final budget. So there is a tremendous amount of change from our preliminary budget. We found some ways to reduce costs as should be expected, and also change some estimates to make them more in line with what we should be expecting and what should be realized. The one thing that is included, you'll see in federal sources, we do have some ESSER funding that's included in our budget, which is why you see a change in our total overall expenditures. While remaining close to the same, we reduced expenditures in other categories. So our total anticipated revenues, or budget revenues, is 129 million. Our total budget expenditures 130.5 million, leaving us with a very minuscule deficit of approximately $1 million. As discussed at our preliminary budget meeting, the 2023 budget did not include salary increases for our professional staff as the contract wasn't settled. So this budget does have to take into account 2 years of salary increases that we have to budget for, which is a driver of this number and a driver of this number, as most of our teacher salaries are in regular education and special education, along with the associated benefits. The same data is presented by object, so that you can kind of get a feel for 67% is salary and benefits. So this makeup, so to speak, on salaries is the primary driver of this increase in our 100 level category for our budget. The rest of the way is relatively static. This chart is essentially a regurgitation of the prior chart. You can see 42% salary, 42% employee benefits. This is the vast majority of what the school district is, salaries and benefits. So certainly our employment considerations, our level of employment is our biggest decision when it comes budget time. The next biggest item, 12%, I did provide a description down here. This includes our tuitions, outside tuitions, charter schools, our transportation costs. So that's our second biggest, or yes, technically our third biggest category of expenditures. I thought some historical context might be important. So I took a look at some of our fastest changing expenditures over the years. I'm sure you've all heard in the past that the change in the PACERS rate and our contribution rate has been a primary driver of cost. And here you can see here that at one point we were only contributing $4 million to the pension system, and now we're well over $18 million. So after the past decade, that was a mountain to overcome. And this is the primary driver of a lot of tax increases across the state, including Cheltenham. I pointed out that healthcare costs are also another fast increasing cost. With in the past few years, we've had between 8 and 10% increases to our health insurance. an item we continually take a look at. Debt service started just below 10 million and now we're just above 11 million. So all these construction projects didn't add a whole net increase, a significant net increase to our budget. Instead, these projects were phased in as one budget. There's one debt service expired, another one replaced it. So I think this reflects to a good deal of management to our debt service. And on the bottom here is the green. This is our charter school expense, and you can see during COVID, that's the cause for this massive jump. Moving forward, we are expecting a slight dip in enrollment in charter schools, but as charter school enrollment is based on budget, as our budget increases, so is our charter school tuition. So the decrease in enrollment is partially offset by the increase in tuition. All right, so what does this all mean? So looking at our proposed final budget and our slim deficit of $1 million, what is the proposed resolution to plug the budget deficit? The proposed final budget does include a 1.1% increase in the real estate tax rate to cover this, which is the approximate amount needed to cover this slight deficit. And I just wanted to point out that it is well below our Act 1 index, which is the maximum we can raise taxes to, and that's 4.1% for the 23-24 school year. Included in the history is, included in this slide is a history of Act 1 back to 2007, 2008. You can see the gradual increase to 4.1% in the current year. The tax rate is currently to be determined on June 13th with a 1.1% proposal. But in the past couple of years, you can see we've come in well below our well below Act 1. So what would a 1.1% tax increase mean on the average homeowner? An individual with the median home assessment in Cheltenham is $142,865. So for the average home, that's about a $385,000 home in actual appraised value. That's $66.80 a month or $81 a year. And then we kind of for illustrative purposes showed what it would look like as you increase that amount, as you almost double that amount to approximately a $700,000 market value home, which is about $128 a year. And to put into further context, I included the 5-year history and the 10-year history of property tax rate changes amongst all school districts in Montgomery County. Just to point out that Cheltenham, we're somewhere in the middle of the pack. We're trying to get to the bottom of the pack in terms of tax increases, with an average tax increase over the last 9 years, 2.9%, and a current year projected tax increase that is well below what you would see in the county average. Just from some preliminary conversations with other business managers, I think they're looking at tax increases, closer in this range. All right, so upcoming board action on May 9th is the proposal to adopt this proposed final budget, which we will be advertised in public space for further examination, which will include more detail about what's in the budget. This is really a high-level look. And on June 6th will be our next Finance Committee meeting, where we'll take another look at the final budget, and on June 13th, make a recommendation for approval for the final budget. Any questions on the proposed final budget?
Want to go to the board?
Just a clarifying question on if you can go to the slide where you're a couple more back with the proposed. I think this is it. Yeah, that one.
This one or no?
The smaller one. One more further. One more after that. No, one more after that. It had like 7 lines, and it showed just this high level summary of revenues and expenditures.
This is it.
Type in 14 and return, please.
14.
14 and return, please.
Yeah,
Should get that.
it's page 14. It's further than this. I apologize. That's the
this
one.
one. Okay.
Thank you. Did I have 7 lines? So I just wanted to clarify that proposed budget revenues line is before a tax increase, correct? The 129.45.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah.
So that is already taking into account sort of structural revenue increases that we saw in our or see in our projected budget.
That's correct, yes.
I also just a comment, which is, we've been looking at surpluses this year and the previous year. And so I know last month we talked about recognize that in our proposed budget. The other side is we need to recognize the significant amount of work that we need to do in terms of our capital projects. So I appreciate that this number is definitely it's absolutely on the lower side of what we have done recently. It's also on the lower side of, it's only 25% of what Act 1 index is. So thank you for putting together a presented, responsible tax increase that reflects both our current financial state and our future financial need.
Bill?
The slide that has the sources of revenue that includes ESSER. That one up, do you know? Sorry. Yeah, that's it. So with those ESSER funds won't be available. You're projecting that they will be available?
There's a portion of 24 and 25 in which they will be available.
Okay.
We have more than that to spend. This budget doesn't 100% include capital spending.
Okay.
So there's still some questions to be answered as the feasibility plan is developed. Can we use some of that ESSER for some capital improvements that are needed throughout the district? Where you might see that additional ESSER money spent as part of the capital project or capital reserve fund rather than the general fund.
But you're projecting a lower revenue from local sources, even with a projected 1.1% increase in local taxes. That's what I'm looking at, right?
This does not include an increase in taxes.
Okay, so
This is before.
before the increase in taxes in 2022, 23, the projection for the end of this year from local sources is closer to 103 million.
Yes, that's correct.
And so why are we projecting 1.8 million less from local sources that needs to be made up by this tax increase? That's what I'm trying to understand.
So there's a couple pieces that go into that.
Okay.
This year we had some real estate tax settlements and some interim taxes that came in. Those are done. Those have expired. So we don't have any on the books, any payments for next year. And that was almost $500,000 in and of itself. On top of that, we have, let's see if I can jump out of this. We have quite a bit of interest income. And so I didn't include this in my slide deck.
Sorry for that. I don't mean to be questioning.
No, these are great questions. So
Okay.
on the top chart here, this is the Fed Reserve rate. This is what the Fed rates for its bank reserve were 4.5%. If you look at interest income, it follows that very closely.
As it should.
As it should. So we're projected to have almost $2 million through the end of this year. Do we expect with the economic slowdown to collect another $2 million next year? That's a difficult question. It's difficult to budget another $2 million for next year. So
That's the answer.
that's the answer.
The answer is we just can't count on that interest income. Okay. We want to be mindful of our need to be prudent with managing our finances and not refusing to raise taxes necessary to meet our needs at the same time. In a year of surplus, we also should be reticent about raising taxes that don't need to be raised. And just to summarize, the fact that we had $2 million of interest income this year that we can't count on in the future makes it prudent, in your view, to have the small tax increase so that in the event that doesn't happen, we don't have a major deficit.
That's correct. It's not a revenue stream, it's dependable. We spent a lot of time as a business manager group speaking to economists about what they think holds for the next fiscal year. A lot of individuals are predicting recession, which would trigger a reduction in the reserve rate to stimulate the economy. Typically, these things follow election cycles. 2024 is an election cycle. All those things to me kind of point to not getting $2 million next year. Interesting.
Thank you.
Just add one other brief note, sorry, that's a jump, but also even if we were to receive it next year, we're not going to be able to assume we'll receive it for the next 10 years. So in a sense, it's one-time revenue each time it occurs. And yet the expenses that it's offsetting are not one-time expenses. Thank you.
Mr. Collins?
So looking at slide 13, the chart, the increase in pensions from 22, 23 to 23, 24 is just under $1 million. And that is very close to the difference on slide 14 of just over $1 million. And just rhetorically, if you can correct me or agree or expand upon this, we have no control over a pension teaser cost. And that's something which is determined, dictated by the state. And it's been very high for a long time, over 30% for a large number of years. And my understanding, the expectation is it should stay at that level or near that level going forward for a long time. And again, to reiterate, we have no control in terms of setting what the pension rate is for teasers. Is that correct?
That's correct. Maybe I need to include in the slide deck for next month a look at what costs are mandated and pushed to the school district by the state, which is essentially a passing the buck of tax responsibility from the state level to the local level to deal with some of the larger state problems. So the PSER system is essentially a nearly bankrupt pension system that requires now 34 cents on the dollar contribution from the school district to keep it afloat and to push it in the right projection. The anticipated contribution rate is still hovering around 40%, pushing now forward. PSERS did revise their estimate to a drop to 34% for next year, which is a drop of 1.26%, which almost never happens. Because we still have increasing salaries, so even with that drop, we don't necessarily feel that effect as a reduction in expenditures.
Thank you.
But yes, this chart was to point out we have mandated costs, whether it be charter school tuition costs that we have to incur, pension costs. A lot of our special ed costs are mandated services. So when you put all that together and you put together what the state has contributed in terms of us trying to balance our budget with these costs, you can see that the district responsibility has grown significantly over the years, and our taxing responsibility has grown significantly over the years as well.
I'm not into the weeds, as you alluded to about the teacher cost, but also about the charter school cost. Besides being mandated costs that effectively can be just being passed on to the school district, which is true in actuality, those costs are very high, including for charter schools. And again, we have no say in terms of what those costs are. It's due to decisions made at the state level that we're obligated to follow. And by the way, thank you.
Yes, I want to first question, and just to clarify, for the slide 10, where you have projection of revenues and expenditures, from the federal sources, that does not include as revenue the ESSER funds for 23-24?
It includes what we have budgeted to date for the ESSER funds. So what you see in federal revenue is just offset by federal expense. So we're using the federal revenue as prudently as possible to leverage future benefit from that money, but not building it into our budget. Where we have to count on it.
We do it.
Because we know it's not.
Okay, thank you.
I have one more. Nobody else does. There's two slides that I want to ask you to focus on. The first one is the comparative district to district slide. that's the first time I'm seeing this as a board member, and I appreciate that very much. We here in Cheltenham, that we're the highest tax district in the county a lot. And I just think it's notable that for the last 5 to 10 years, we've been making up for things that happened 15 years ago and more. Because us being the highest tax district in the county didn't happen in the last 10 years. It happened before that. And we're dealing with the legacy of that still. So I just wanted to point out that that's at least one takeaway from this chart that perhaps we hadn't all noted before. And then to the line graph with the elements that goes that one. Yeah, I'd love to see 2 more lines there for next time. The teacher salaries, special ed costs, which are 2 things you mentioned in talking about things we don't have. We have control over the teacher salaries, but once they're set, they're set. And special ed costs, we have almost no control over. And we need, I mean, we have some control over it, but it would be good to see in that way on that kind of graph. So we have an understanding of its rate of increase or decrease. All right, that was all. Thank you.
Mr. Cohen?
And looking at slide 10 at the state sources, if you could talk a little bit about how that number was derived at, and also my understanding is that the state budget routinely trails the school district's budget. So in other words, we have to vote and approve, develop and vote and approve a budget before we know how much money we're getting from the state. So if you can talk a little bit about how you arrived at that number, again, recognizing per my statement that that's based on some assumptions and past history, but if you can just talk a little bit about the state number and how that was arrived at.
Sure. So our budget in 22-23 did not include any sort of increase for our basic educational subsidy or our special ed educational subsidy, because that was not passed by the state until after June 30th. This current year obviously does include that budget increase because it's anticipated for it to return, but we're still waiting on those final numbers. Typically in a given year, the state will say we're going to get X number of dollars, and we'll get somewhere between 25 to 50% in that. A lot of it is posturing, it seems, when the initial budget's made, and then as they bargain their way down to the actual budget. So there is still the potential for some sort of increase. I would call it unlikely we get that number before June 13th, but the moment we get it, it will be updated. And one distinction between this year and last year, we had a homestead increase, if you recall. That was just announced yesterday that is going to remain the same as last year. So there's no anticipated budget increase for that in the current year.
Thank you very much.
I just wanted to add that in April, some of our board members participated in Advocacy Day. And some of these issues were put on the table as concerns for our district and priorities for our district. One being charter school reform and having a fairly funded formula that would require charter schools to basically come under one, state mandates and requirements, but also that school districts weren't paying higher costs to charter schools. Another area was asking for money for unfunded mandates that we have to absorb. The other area was playing time, and that was to address the operational capital improvements that need to be made, seeing that there's funding given. We met with Senator Haywood and State Representative Nelson. And one of the things that was told to us, communicated with us, is one, that we should make sure we understand and know what legislative bills are being proposed and voicing our, adding our voices and advocating for support in those particular areas, because they will go further than having something that's outside of those mandates. And we also will stay in contact with them so that we do understand. Representative Nelson is specifically on the Education Committee, so he's aware of the bills that are being proposed. So that is important for not only us as board members, but also for community members to understand and advocate for those changes that we know we need in our school districts to provide adequate funding.
I had one follow-up. I'm sorry for dominating the questioning. When you talk with your fellow business managers, the political landscape is such that are other people proposing flat state funding, or it seemed like there was some kind of groundswell for at least some increase by percentage of what we could expect from the state. Am I misreading the politics?
Before, most business managers are hesitant to put anything in the budget until it is official. Otherwise, you're basing a tax rate on something that you aren't guaranteed to get.
Okay, but, okay.
And the proposal pretty much keeps up with inflation.
Oh, it doesn't do more than that?
It doesn't do more.
Oh, I thought it did. I
Yeah.
thought-
No, you're
it was-
probably.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, all right.
There's-
Right.
There's a current piece of the basic ed formula, which is the level up formula, which is for the most disadvantaged school districts in the state. And,
But that was.
that doesn't take
Thank you.
Mr. Schultz?
Just before we go to the public, I wanted to reiterate and make sure it's very clear through a question about the timeline for what happens next. We will be asked, the board will be asked to vote on what we were just presented, not as the final action, but as the next to final action. This is the time to have those discussions, because once that occurs, will be advertised as the final proposed budget, and we're limited to the ability to change it. So I just wanted to make sure that it was clear that this is the time to ask whatever.
Okay.
Sorry. Do you have a question? That was all. Is that correct? That's the case, correct? This is great. Thank you.
If I just add to try to clarify the language for not our fault, it's the way Act 1 is done, is that it's really almost frankly a little bit bizarre, where there's the proposed final budget, as stated up there, which will be next week, and that'll be voted on as a proposed final budget. And then in June, we'll be voting on the final budget.
Right.
So it is really counterintuitive, quirky, due to the language and nomenclature, but that's the way it's structured. So to be clear, that next week we'll be voting or asked to vote on the proposed final budget, and that'll be to vote on literally a proposed final budget. And then in June, we'll be voting on the final budget.
I'd like to open it up to the public. If you have any questions about these items, state your name and where you reside.
Michael Brooks, Alpine Park. As it is presented now, for individuals that have lived in Cheltenham over 15 years, there is an appreciation for the tax rate, but it's almost in a level of insensitivity to say, well, we could have raised it more, but we're going to raise it 1. When in reality, we're still top 3 when it comes to revenue. So although you have it there, it kind of lightened the blow a little bit. From my perspective, it almost has an elitist sound. And from the perspective of, we're allowed to go up a difference of 4%, and the other people went up more in the last couple of years. Well, they're still paying catch up for the already high, tax rate. So, I mean, understandable is necessary. I'm just not sure the approach of saying, well, we only went up 1% kind of takes the sting away a little bit.
I'm sorry, I look at it that way as kind of a procedural. It comes out wrong because it's procedural for us. So back in December, we have to make a decision about whether we need to go to special referendum to go above our Act 1 index. So when I say we didn't go up to the Act 1 index, we didn't meet that index, it's kind of like, because I'm referencing that procedural process, not, I mean, the goal is to have no tax increase and to work with our means.
Because if the person from the public sees that and they interpret it on their own, and in the back of their mind, they still know we're still high, but it's like.
But we have to advertise it. We have to say, because we vote on those, on the Act 1 index. So we do have to say that if the Act 1 index that we voted on was at, like, for example, 4.9%.
And one, an important hear what you say 100%. So I'm not, this isn't meant as a counter to what you're saying, but in context. The role of the Act 1 index is, I see it as almost a pacing. To use, maybe that's a sports analogy. I'm not great at sports, so yeah. But it's sort of an indication of this is how much costs are increasing. So we're, roughly 4%. So the fact that we're able to get under it doesn't help. It's still increase. It still stinks. I hear you, but it does also.
Your context matters, what you just said.
Great.
The cost, saying the cost went up 4%, but we're on raising it 1%. That's different than saying, it's different, the differentiation that we could have went to 4, but the context of cost versus,
That's very helpful.
that may help, just that one word shift will help.
Understood.
Thank you.
I'm sorry,
Thank
I'm doing this too long.
Yeah.
No, no problem.
I don't think about the public's perspective.
I think the other thing is that, on balance, you might say to yourself, when you got this money in October, you're not using that dog set, not raising tax. But we've used that year after year, which means we're really kind of starting to pay back. So I think in context with what Mr. Schultz said, combination still doesn't change the fact that we're raising taxes,
Right.
but it kind of helps you with 4%.
Oh, definitely. Your presentation matters. And so it's almost, the one is like, well, we could have went higher as opposed to saying costs were here, but we were trying to be conservative when we were here.
Right.
Gives a better
Yeah,
acceptance.
Dan's the politician. And the other thing that we can't fall prey to is that we resist raising taxes because we think that's what the public wants, and that's what we want, is we're all taxpayers. But then we put ourselves in a position of having a structural deficit, which most of the people on this board, these 2 years are the first since I've been on the board where we didn't have to worry about having a pretty significant deficit and looking at being forced to raise taxes up to index or else. And we did have a couple of years where we didn't raise taxes, and then we put ourselves behind the 8 ball. And now this is prudent. This is smart and measured and what we need in order to both serve our taxpayers and make sure that we fund the district the way it needs to be funded. Does that resonate?
Oh, no, I'm financial background, so I get everything. I was more so deliveries,
Yeah.
Any other questions from the public?
Tara Knox, Wincode. In terms of the costs that are paid for the charter schools, has there been a study or a survey put out to the families to understand why they chose to send their child to a charter school as opposed to keeping them in the district?
So in the past, and Dr. Scrivener, I wish he was present, he wasn't able to make it today. Yes, so we did it. As a matter of fact, after COVID, there was a concerted effort not only to find out why our students left, and during the pandemic, a lot of it was due to being back in school, mask, no mask. People wanted to keep their children virtual, and so there was specific outreach made to all of those students and parents to get them to come back into the district. And that work is still going on. And we did, what was it, like maybe 20 or 25 or so, maybe students did end up coming back.
More than that, actually, yeah, I think it was more than that, yeah.
Yeah. So we are, that is always that's a priority for us, to make sure our students want to be in the district and they understand what's offered to them here.
And Mr. Stryker, please correct me if I'm wrong, but the majority of our students who are enrolled in charter schools are enrolled in cyber charter schools, not brick and mortar. And cyber charter schools. But cyber charter schools are, they get, a flat rate and they don't use it all, and then they get an incredible amount of money for kids with IEPs. That oftentimes doesn't get used, which is why you see cyber charter schools, advertising and, sponsoring rides at Hershey Park and, all of that kind of thing, because they have a lot of excess. So that's a whole other area of advocacy, but most of our school, and for what it's worth, in other school districts in Montgomery County, I've seen some of their charter school enrollment numbers. We're on the low side, actually, for residents who have enrolled in charter schools. There are other school districts in the county that have far more kids enrolled in cyber charter schools than we do. We're kind of lucky in that regard, I think. What do we pay for students?
One more to the
Other
cost
students,
of
the-
charter schools. We get charged on the basis, it's a formula that includes our population and costs. And Mr. Swigert alluded to this, that our cost per pupil went up. So there may not be more pupils, but there's
It costs, we
the
pay
cost
higher
is,
for charter
you're
school
finding
students than
people,
we
you
do
get
for our own
that. So
students.
it's like that cost doesn't even mean that there's the same amount of students. It's just that our cost went up because it costs more, which is all because of legislation that's just
Which is part of why we were
completely
advocacy
ill-advised.
then.
and, yeah, Needs to be changed.
The state used to reimburse some of those charter school costs.
So,
Yeah,
And the special needs portion of the students is higher, so the cost per student is even higher on average because there's so many students with IEPs going to cyber charter schools. It's all a mess, but that's the explanation.
Thank you.
Any other questions from the public? Okay, now I'll see anybody on.
Next slide. Yeah, but I think I've got 142.
All right, so moving on to capital planning, before I flip the next slide, I just would like to preface that there is a lot of estimation in this next slide. It is not estimation based purely out of thin air, based off of costs provided in the past and sometimes recent past, but a lot of estimation. So we talk about the fund balance that the district has, and we talk about the feasibility study and the needs of the school district. The feasibility study focuses on several needs, the primarily of which are Elkins Park and I lost my presentation. Elkins Park and a potential high school replacement. So looking at assuming a 1-for-1 replacement of existing facilities, this is a rough estimate of a potential solution for the feasibility study. You can see that a high school replacement in this day and age is out of reach amongst the current financial condition of the district until that condition changes, until the debt is paid off for the current projects in the district. So you can see that this number drives the total number of all the different projects that need to be taken care of. Again, this is a very rough estimate. It's based off of square footage and recent bid results in some cases. And some of this is based off of a feasibility study that was done in 2015, 2016, with cost escalators built in from discussions with various architects and construction management firms. So all in all, a 1-for-1 replacement of the facilities we need to continue as we're continuing is approximately $229 million, almost $230 million in capital investment. Now, what available resources do we have? Well, we have 13 million in general fund assigned to capital projects. We have 16.7 million in our capital reserve fund. We have a $2.25 million fire alarm replacement at the high school. And what available debt space do we realistically have? By my best estimate, it's probably around $50 million. So our available resources are approximately $77 million, leaving a shortfall of $152 million to address all of our capital needs. That's where the feasibility study comes in. I mean, this project can wait. This project may need to be retooled. If this project happens, there's no way this happens. So that's what the feasibility study is. It's taking the needs that are this big and you can't see it now, that are it's taking a lot of large needs with less resources and trying to find a solution that works best for everyone. Just a little context for the $50 million debt issue. What is the appropriate level of debt for a school district? So this was done across the Delaware Valley, so Chester, Delaware, Montgomery, Bucks, Philadelphia counties. What is their debt service as a percentage of their expenditures? You can see we're right in the middle. This holds true if you expand it to all 500 school districts in Pennsylvania. So, I mean, how far should we push the debt limit? Is it 10%? Is it 15%? Probably being prudent, we don't want to go much higher than 10% because we would need debt space in the event we ever had an emergency pop up, God forbid. So we really only have a certain level of debt room space, which is about $3 million annually, which equates to about $50 million of debt service. So in a very rough estimate, kind of a snapshot of the feasibility study going forward, this is a very high level. We'll look at one option for that feasibility study, assuming the most basic option, which is a 1-for-1 replacement. Now the reason this is presented is because it feeds right into the high school stadium. So looking at a potential high school stadium project, this is on the radar to happen. It's not a large piece of this puzzle. It is something that benefits all the students of high school, whether it be graduation, gym class, class activities, community lunch, or sports, because every sport can play on the stadium. So it almost seems as if there's no reason for this to wait until the end of the feasibility study, because it's probably something more than likely we will move forward with anyway. So this estimate was developed with KCBA, who's currently working on our feasibility study, and was developed back in the fall. So that was to answer your question, Leah, from prior. How do we know that the facilities are going to stay the way they are in the future as the way they are now? So that feasibility study was done in 2015, 2016, which is posted on our website. They did do a grand schematic. What would new construction look like at the high school? Assuming this project is pushed back until we have the debt capacity to tackle it in 10, 15 years, the existing building can be essentially reconstructed, starting with softball fields and working its way back. So all the sporting facilities, all the sport facilities that exist behind it can in essence remain where they're at without impacting any sort of future plan. So the idea is this investment is longer than 10, 15-year investment. It's a maintenance of where it is in the future. So going forward, a recommended action for the next board meeting would be to engage with a civil engineer through KCBA to begin taking a look at what this project could cost and what will be required for it to be completed. And the reason for the timing of it in May, like I said, we began this process back in the fall, is that through the Conservation District of Montgomery County, there's an 8 to 9 month review process for projects that impact stormwater management, which this would fall under. So in order to get this project moving and a potential to even put it on the radar for a 2024 school year, now some sort of action will need to be taken to engage with a professional to begin looking at this. Any questions, Pete?
So a few things. Following up on your last point, it's going to probably also to go through subdivision land development township as well, which also is going to require some time and some resources. A few other points of comments. Going way back in time when the football field had lights installed, there was, from my perspective as a community member back then, kind of an afterthought to look at trying to get outside resources to pay for part of that cost. So if there could be an attempt to try to get, not to pay for the entire cost, I'm not that naive, but to try to look at whether it's boosters or if there's any within reason within our policies in terms of commercial sponsorship for the football stadium or the bleachers, I'd encourage the district to look at that sooner versus later to try to start getting that process rolling moving forward. And the last point I want to make is that you somewhat alluded to this, but of course, when we incur more debt that has to be paid back almost entirely, the vast majority of it at least is by real estate taxes. So that's another limitation that circles back to again, trying to limit real estate tax increases. And I'm glad that you raised the point that it'll take, in very broad terms, about 10 or 15 years to pay down debt in a meaningful way before we can likely afford a new high school, because that's also well taken in that we decided as a school district to rebuild 5 of our 7 schools. And we did it in a pretty short time window. And even though our debt is, I'm glad to hear it's below 10%, it's still going to be at that level. My understanding is, or close to that level for about 10 or 15 years, because again, we have a large amount of debt accumulated and we have been paying off gradually. We did do a great job refinancing, but it will take, as you said or suggested, about 10 or 15 years to pay it off in a meaningful way, whereby we're at that point in time where we can afford a new high school. And that also presumes that our newer buildings are getting older every day. We're not going to have to incur, whether it's nickel and dime and death by 1,000 cuts or by a few more meaningful cuts over 10, 15 years. Those are not going to have to be in a situation where we start to incur meaningful costs, such as hypothetically new roofs or other things, or a bunch of smaller ones that add up as well, which could then impede our ability to then afford to incur more debt. So thank you.
So I mean, the situation shown then isn't unlike a lot of school districts in this area, in that a lot of the school districts were built in 1955, 1960 timeframe, all at the same time, because that's when there was a population boom in this area. And it's a difficult question. You're right, Dave. We replaced a lot of buildings in a short period of time, but it would have been a difficult conversation in the 80s or 90s to say, hey, we should start replacing some of these buildings so we don't incur all this massive debt in the future, when everyone else will say, well, they're perfectly fine, so why would we do that? So that decision, which would have been a difficult one to space out all this construction, didn't happen a long time ago. But to be fair, it would have been a difficult thing to do.
Thank you.
Yeah, but I think that, kind of piggybacking what you said, preventive maintenance is going to be key for our newer buildings to make sure that they have a useful life as long as possible, so that we don't incur or have to incur tremendous amount of debt.
So you want a 50-year capital.
Mr. Schultz?
I have 2 questions. The first is just, can you expand on what's the difference between, I can imagine what they are, but I would love to hear the actual answer. Stadium improvements and sports facility improvements. So what are the things that are, what are the examples of the sports facility improvements?
So that would be football practice field, soccer field, baseball fields, soccer fields, softball fields, field hockey field. CrossFit.
So we would be fields less than the actual building itself, in terms of lockers, et cetera. Okay, thank you. And the stadium, I understand why the stadium is the highest priority of sports. Are the other facilities, like what is the time frame in which, and I think this maybe speaks to what Ms. Logan was asking, in which that would be a projected priority?
So this is very narrow in scope in terms of stands, playing surface, track, because of that's something that benefits a multitude of sports. So the rest of it will be part of the feasibility study.
Yeah, I sort of envision this in my head. If in 10 years or 15 years, we think about following that plan to rebuild the high school on the softball fields, then you're going to have the opportunity to completely reconfigure all the rest of the fields. And if we build the stadium, it'll stay where it is. But everything else, like Springfield, if you drive by Springfield, it's where I went, and it's so obvious that they reused every inch of space outside that building and made a gorgeous sports complex that we could do, but we don't want to do that until we know what's going to happen with the high school. And but in the interim, we need to make sure that the baseball fields are safe and that the soccer fields are safe, and they're just fields. I mean, I don't think that really hurts our competitiveness. I mean, my son was both a baseball player and a soccer player. The field stunk, but he didn't, you know, it wasn't that big a deal for the team. So yeah, as long as they took out the divots and filled in the holes, and yeah, that's my point of view.
I had a second question, if I could. I led with that, just to be clear. I had 2 questions. The second question is, no, you're good, is about available financial resources. And those are clearly the ones that are directly available to us. But insofar as this is a conversation starter slide, I would like to understand over time, what are possible capital improvement or capital fundraising plans that we, trying to have a capital campaign Or what is realistic over the next 10 to 15 years around PlanCon? If we actually think about, is that actually realistically zero? Is there, and if it were to be refunded, I actually don't, because I don't think I was around when PlanCon was around. What does that translate to in terms of dollars, potential dollars and cents?
So plan cover like the educational space, so it would be Elkins Park.
Right, and is it a 50%, like what rate, what's the ratio of
Depends on the
coverage?
phase of the project.
Okay, so not 50%, all right, that's, I don't know why I thought that, but seriously, the fundraising and reaching out to alumni and having an actual like meeting campaign, since we were talking 20 years, I hope that we might think about that,
We're looking for some boosters too.
right? All right, I'm done, thank you.
Oh, you're right.
That's all good.
Wait a minute. So semi-related to that as well, start with what Mr. Schultz said is that, that idea of it's, and I think it's bigger than boosters. This is, I don't know what the answer is, like, do school districts, public school districts, I don't know if you know the answer, Mr. Spark, have like a person that does grants, like a grants officer or a development officer that specifically does. When would you have time to go find the grants that we could apply for?
So
You
a
know?
lot of districts have a federal coordinator, federal programs coordinator, and they work with federal grants and state grants and pursuing what other grants come about. Cheltenham has not historically had one
Right.
because we historically have not gotten much federal money. We usually get less than $500,000, which would justify an administrative position. ESSER kind of changed that, but ESSER was on temporary, so that final decision has been made, but it's certainly considered.
But just something to think, like, just because I know that there's probably money out there that we could go after, and it might be a little thing here and a little thing here, but no one probably, it's hard to have the capacity and bandwidth for someone to do that.
And we've had that conversation in the past, and it was for the reasons that
Yeah.
Mrs.
Which
Spigart,
makes sense.
yeah, but it still is something that gets talked about.
And then just to follow back to the details, and just because this is the kind of question that I would have if I was a parent, when we start to get into the weeds of the different, the sports facility improvements versus the stadium improvements. The stadium improvements, the field, the track, the grandstand, or whatever we call it, does that include all of the track facilities that are part of track and field as a sport, or just the physical track? Do you know, if you know the answer to that?
Just the physical
Just the physical track, so not where you're throwing and jumping and all of that. Yeah. Okay,
The focus is on the
Yes.
items that benefit the most of the kids most of the time.
I see, okay. And then the second question is the sports facility improvements, does that include, that's only the outside facilities, not the indoor facilities?
Correct.
So pool, gymnasium, locker rooms, all falls under the high school replacement costs. Okay, I just want to, again, that's, if I was a parent, that's what I am a parent, but. Thank you.
Mr. Epps?
Is there a generally acceptable practice or standard around where or what percentage that should not exceed for school groups?
I don't think there is a finite rule. Whenever we do a bond issue, you're right, a refinance will get rated by a bond rating agency, and they'll typically say 13 is like the max, 13% is the max they want to see. Our debt, they would say, is healthy, but they call all the debt in this area a little on the high side because of the situation I described earlier, where everyone in this area has incurred a lot of debt recently to revamp their districts.
Okay, appreciate that. And then Mr. Cohen sort of made a comment around this, but I wanted to follow up. Over past facilities meetings, we've heard there's certain projects like at EP that would have to happen before it's like fully addressed, possibly the same at the high school. And so is that, I guess what I'm directly getting at is, should we expect to have some of those conversations like next year, or are we some time away from that?
So we did make that investment in EMG, which is a great tool. And you can run a report that says current needs, immediate needs in the district. If I run that report now, it's just a whole bunch of red flags for Elkins Park and this building, the administrative building. The biggest expense is a roof for this facility. Actually, it's well over $2 million estimated cost. So if I use those resources, that's what they're telling me.
Not at the high school.
There's no immediate need on the high school.
Okay.
Now that this
Except for the fire.
That's fine. Well, that's already there. That's already there.
I think great. Certainly.
Yeah, okay. so something like the HVAC AC, is that more of a cosmetic thing that just could certainly be deferred until we deal with it, or?
So at the high school, it is one of our only facilities without air conditioning. And it has an older HVAC system, so that's why it kind of surfaced itself on the radar as a potential project moving forward.
But it wouldn't become an immediate need because of its.
Correct. Immediate is, the roof is
Safety,
leaking, like I
things
said,
like that, yeah.
or, the boiler's about to go out and back heat.
What's up there? So to the point, and I think some of other folks are saying it as well, but it's as we get this feasibility study, as we're considering what we're going to have to pay for in the short term, essentially, hopefully, doesn't push us back, doesn't make that 15-year, 20-year, and so forth. Appreciate that.
Any other questions you have? Looks like y'all might
They're
have
having a cabinet meeting.
I'll say this.
Name it, we still have
No
to
problem.
formality,
Mark,
sorry.
part. If I'm being honest, I would have loved to have seen this particular forecast prior to tonight. As status quo, I've looked at all the districts in Montgomery County over the last week or so, and I'm at like 95% of those proposals being available prior to a month out. So that kind of digest that. Our initial thoughts was looking at, number one, the decrease in some budgets, but the fact that we have technically a deficit that's going to require a tax rate increase kind of lends itself to being less sensitive in a sense. But dissecting this, we'll probably have a lot of questions next month as we dissect this document. Taryn, keep me honest if you have any other perspectives on that.
Taryn Knox. So I was, just piggyback off the meeting we had last week, asking specific questions about what is the proposed budget for next season? How much of that is budgeted out for athletics? How much of that is budgeted for the football team? I know I wrote down, initially I wrote down 1.2 million for the entire budget, but it's 1.5, and I think $75,000 for the football team. And piggyback off of what Mike just said, I know I spent my entire weekend looking at every school district in Montgomery County and their budgets and how much they budget out for athletic teams, what the percentages is, what the real estate tax rates are, just because I just want to enjoy doing that. But two, we want to get to the bottom of all of it. And what we found, we fell in comparison to our surrounding districts was kind of interesting. We're about 1.2% for student activities, where most of our surrounding districts are 1.4% or higher. So the question is, okay, well, why are we at 1.2%? But okay, we just know we have a deficit, and how do we get progressive towards matching other districts? Of course, we know we have this proposal with the stadium improvements and the facility improvements that will kind of answer some of those questions, but it's just, that was kind of my question coming in, looking at where we're at in terms of percentage, where the surrounding districts are at. We are just much lower than everyone else. So that was, but this kind of answers some of that, but we need a little bit more, like Mike said, with the next meeting, we probably can ask more questions. Another question about the stadium improvement, facility improvements. I know that doesn't just include the football stadium. That's for also, you said the soccer field, the baseball field. From priority safety standpoint, for the baseball fields and for the throwing field for the track team. The baseball field has no dugout. So in the event of incoming severe weather, they have nowhere to get to quickly if lightning was to come. Is that something, I don't know if that's in the feasibility stuff, but is that something that's considered a priority of facility improvements? Because it doesn't just impact, that's where the track team is, the baseball team. I don't know if that's where the lacrosse team also plays, but from a safety standpoint, because I know this happened at a track meet a few weeks ago in Coatesville, a severe storm came in within minutes and we had to get off the field, but there was someone for everyone to go very quickly. With our current field, there is nowhere for them to go very quickly in the event that just happened. So is that considered within this improvement? Is that considered priority list for safety? For not just the football stadium, but for all the fields?
Maybe like a field house.
Yes.
That would be part of, that question had to be answered after the Elkins Park question and high school questions are answered. So I think before the stadium project expands to include other facilities, I think we need to address where we're educating our elementary school students and how we're handling Elkins Park and how we're handling the high school and its deficiencies as well. But that's part of the broader feasibility study.
Okay. Thank you.
Hi, Dana Burney, East Cheltenham. One of my questions, I'm not sure if it pertains to this. Oh my gosh, because of my mind is moving. Boosters. I think that's, pardon me, a little old and antiquated. But that's how Cheltenham is. I've been here 12, 13 years. I'm going to take it more progressive to get sponsorship. I don't know where we are with that. I know that there are big corporations that would like to feed into Cheltenham. I don't know within the bylaws or regulations or whatever you have on your board, what is stopping us from doing that, because a lot of this can be eliminated if we have sponsorship.
Do you know who they are? Do you have names and numbers?
Well,
Seriously? Yeah, I mean, that's a serious question. You said,
can we do it though? Because I
oh,
know
it can be done.
there's a policy.
Okay.
In the policy.
But we have some parameters in the policy.
Right,
right.
So let me just hypothetically speaking, if there was something like maybe Abington Hospital, this is just an example. Abington Hospital wants to pay for our scoreboard, right? They might want to put Abington Hospital on there. Is there some type of parameter where they're be restricted not to be able to put their name on it? Because I think when we get sponsorship like that, they might want to tag something on there. You know, are we?
So we have to look at our name policy,
Okay.
our naming policy.
Okay.
Okay. Our parameters for our policy in terms of sponsorship is typically looking at things that we cannot do. Would be antithetical to having a educational or school building. Like we wouldn't want to sponsor that sponsoring cigarettes. For example.
Right, I understand that. I understand that. So say for example,
So, yes, we have to look at
I'll give another hypothetical situation. What if a Rothman Orthopedics came in and said, hey, we want to do your whole stadium over in high school? Would that be in the issue?
We'd have to look at our naming
Policy,
policy.
policy 713 is just for other than, and it's on board docs. You can look at policy 713, and there's an administrative regulation as well that lays out a lot.
So I think that the answer to the question is, it's a possibility. It's something that, depending on who the sponsor could be, who they are, and it would also require board conversation and approval for those things. But the possibility exists.
We need names.
I just because I know business owners that are my friends and just opening up their businesses in Cheltenham, there was so much red tape and, you know.
But that's not, we don't have that.
I know. But it's just like, it's the old way of thinking and we need to get a little bit more progressive in our thinking. That's my first question. Second question. Speaking of budgets, now, when we have a budget, we have allocated funds, right? So we have our actual, and then we have what we projected, right? So again, hypothetically situation, we give the football team $75,000, right? We spend $65,000, right? Are we, the next year as it's projected, do you guys add more? Can we overspend? I'm going back to like my church stuff. Like, so like, can we overspend? So, okay, that's 75,000. What if we go to 8? Are we still gonna be allocated those extra funds, and then the next year, it'll be, okay, this is what they actually did in 2023, in 2024, we'll give them $100,000. Like, does that happen?
So the budget is set and that's the allocated amount to spend on football. If we don't spend that amount, the difference goes into fund balance. So that goes into that number, general unassigned balance or capital reserve fund balance is spent on future needs of the district. If you have a situation, say a tornado came through and destroyed all the football helmets and we had to spend, we would find the money to come up with that, to come up with that money to spend more than 75,000 based on need.
Sorry for all the questions. Michael Brooks, Open Spark. Understanding this is a quick process and a lot of the budget writing is done behind the scenes. But is it possible, maybe not this go around, but in futures, to at least put a document out there that kind of talks about your methodology of how you created your budget, some things along those lines to kind of help understand limitations and also the thinking that goes into the process. That I think that would help a lot as far as, from my perspective, understanding was this particular part of the budget done from somebody that's competent from a a knowledge standpoint, or is it a boardroom for people that don't, you know what I mean? So what's the methodology that goes into creating the budget? I know it's about 129 on average, but because this was the number last year, are you going to just throw this number on the paper for this year and backfill it budget from down up, or is it a real process going into, hey, these are our needs, these are the feasibility of this $129,000, we know it's in the budget because these are careers and teachers and PDs, we know that part, but 1.4 for athletics, we know that these are the needs because an analysis was done to come to this number, and we're comfortable. It's not all the things we wanted, but we're comfortable with this number. What goes into the methodology of the process?
So, I mean, as we discussed earlier, the vast majority is salaries and benefits. So, obviously, we have a census, we have a positional budget. We're budgeted for this many positions of this many people. This is how many are actually taking a family policy, a single policy. I mean, that's all right down to an exact science. You have spending at buildings. You look at historical spend. That drives how much we anticipate we're going to need going forward. Less of an exact science because you don't always know if you're going to have, as Tim mentioned earlier, underground electrical line breaks. You have to budget for that, anticipate for that. So that's generally how the budget is driven, is based on historical perspective, historical spending. But a lot of it, 88% of our budget is already contractual. So we have contracts for tuition, we have contracts for transportation. All that is already set in stone going forward even before we start the budget process. So a lot of reading, a lot of time spent digesting contracts, trying to find ways to be more efficient, or when we have the opportunity to do an RFP to get a cheaper price or competitive price, that goes in the budget. So it's a lot of time for a 10-minute presentation.
Of course. And that's why I would like maybe like a methodology that's written somewhere that's saying, like you explain.
And I just want to add, I'm not a budget finance person at all, but when you look at other school districts and what they're spending on their athletic facilities and their extracurriculars, also keep in mind what we're spending for some of our, the fact that we have 30 AP classes at the high school, close to 30 AP classes. Yeah, I mean, some schools, Lower Mary may have that, but a lot of school districts don't have that. I mean, I have a friend who's in a very high achieving school district in Massachusetts. When I told her we had 30 AP, close to 30 AP classes, she couldn't believe it. She couldn't believe how many. So I think that, what looks good outside in the front, on the fancy new thing is great and awesome. And also Springfield Township has really high debt service. Really high debt service. You're not seeing sort of what's going on the inside either necessarily. And so we've got some really great educational programs happening at the high school that, may not be.
Yeah, I'm talking a lot in this meeting. I apologize. But can I?
You're a board.
I don't want to dominate. conversation, but we sit at this table and, you know, some of us have been here for 8 years, 12 years. And the thing that we hear a lot around now is the budget, the business managers will say to the buildings, just because we budgeted, if you haven't spent it now, it's gonna come out. You know, it doesn't just mean you get to waste it if you haven't spent it on what you thought you were gonna need. And I would imagine that goes into what they get allocated, because if they didn't spend it, they didn't really need what they asked for. But at the same time, when coaches tell you they need new uniforms and that's in the budget, it's budget. Right? I mean, okay.
I just want to piggyback off of Ms. Blumen. I'm sorry, my name, Taryn. I'm sorry.
You don't need to, you don't have to.
I just want to say that, you know, in consideration of everything we're saying, I always say to my son, you are a student athlete. We didn't just choose it just because for athletics, it's also for the curriculum. A lot of our athletes are also taking AP classes. So at first they're students, then they're athletes. So we're always keeping that in mind when we're looking at things, because I can assure you that that wasn't the case. A lot of people would not be here. So just I wanted to make sure that you do consider that, and that's a very important thing in my household. When you're at your education, if your education is not up to par, you already know if your grades are not at a certain level, you cannot compete. That's an agreement we have. Your goal is to go to college, you have to have a certain grade point average to get to that level. So you have to be a proficient student athlete. So that's something we discuss amongst our team, amongst the parents, amongst the kids. They all know that. I just wanted to make sure you put that out there.
And proficient is not.
Yeah.
I will let you know.
Yeah, I just want to talk a little bit about going fully into detail about the policy about sponsorship, where for athletic fields, it's much broader, more open than for buildings, but there are still limitations, which I cannot stress enough because it is nuanced, detailed policy. The other point I want to raise is that as one school board member, no guarantees, there's always the potential, at least for the board, to consider amending the policy. At the same time, again, from my perspective, you have to weigh certain things. I think the current policy does, where you don't want to go, from my perspective, in overboard. And as was alluded to by my colleagues, start advertising things that are going to be deleterious or negative towards the school district and or its students as well. So I just wanted to start getting that thought process out there a little bit. Thank you. We can get without getting into the weeds.
All right, if there are no other questions, then I have a motion to adjourn.
Second.
Meeting is.